Hey, I'm Sasan with Proteus Debate Academy. We are a YouTube channel, and what do you make? Well, we make YouTube videos that bring high quality coaching to the debate community, whether that's coaches or competitors across a variety of debate formats. We make some videos based on just what we feel like making. We make some videos based on requests. This video was a request. We haven't made a ton of LD stuff, but I like talking about LD. What's this thing? It's a microphone that should be out of frame, but isn't. Sorry, I just got finished teaching a class, and my brain is fried. But this is the best time I have to make this, because I want to get this video out soon. And it's like 12:20 on Thursday. And I'm hoping this video will be up in like 2 hours. So I already made one of these for a public forum. Today we're going to be going through the potential topics, every potential topic for Lincoln Douglas for the next season. I'm going to give you some thoughts on each one. I already looked at these a little bit. I started to make this video and then I ran out of time and was just like, screw it, I'll just do it all over again and actually finish. And we're gonna break down, hey, which topics do I like, which topics do I not like, but that's also based in, hey, how good is this topic for the affirmative, how good is it for the negative, and what sort of things would you probably talk about. So without any further ado, actually one more ado, leave comments, tell me what you think. Let's talk about these topics. Tell me what else you would like to see. I know it's summer and so not everybody is in like debate mode or whatever, but I get really bored doing this if I'm not talking to people, so you'd be doing me a favor. All right, let's get this antique on the road show. Let's start with September. First topic: the member nations of the World Trade Organization ought to reduce intellectual property protections for medicines. Okay. So the first couple things that one would notice looking at this. Well, it's a World Trade Organization topic. That's kind of not that interesting. One of the things that we should think about, one other quick note, is when I'm talking about these topics, I'm going to be going for a, when appropriate, like a plan-focused approach. And if it's like a value topic, I'm not going to like force there to be a plan, right? So it's not exactly traditional per se. It's not exactly like circuit per se. It's, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, right? I'm going to tell you, like, I'm going to approach policy resolutions as though you're going to have a plan text, but not really going into like, oh, good K ground on this or whatever. So this one, let's get into it. As far as the topic writing, I'd be interested in knowing whether the World Trade Organization is the best actor for this. Like, is this the appropriate actor for having a significant effect on intellectual property for medicine internationally? Because if not, there's going to be a lot of really easy solvency and potentially like some counterplan stuff on the negative. Now, the counterplan ground is going to rely on, remember that counterplans, this is going to be important for all of these, counterplans are not just the negative saying, hey, I thought of a better plan than the affirmative. Counterplans are an opportunity cost disadvantage, which means that the thing you are criticizing the A for is costing us a better opportunity. So you need to show that there is a cost here, right? That we lose an opportunity. That's we call that the counterplan being competitive, right? It competes with doing this alternative. So the only way that really a counterplan on World Trade Organization would work is if you can demonstrate that the World Trade Organization doing this prevents some other group from doing it also and doing it better. That's not really the part of the topic that interests me. The member nations part could be interesting. I think there's a couple parts of this topic that matter. First of all, let's say you don't know anything about this topic. Medicine is a thing that exists, so you need it to live. And people make medicine after doing research. And once you do research, you get a patent that shows you invented this medicine, this specific combination of stuff, chemicals. And once you've figured out which specific combination of chemicals to make, you get a patent, which gives you, or you buy the patent from whoever figured it out, and that gives you exclusive right to sell this medicine. Not all medicine is patented, or it is patented, but you're allowed to whatever, right? You're allowed to make generic versions. A generic version of a drug is you just take that drug, you figure out, oh, okay, the way you make this allergy medicine is you combine these chemicals. Great, I will combine these chemicals and sell it myself. And I can sell it for way cheaper because I'm not trying to make back the money I spent on all of the research and testing and whatever to get to the point where I figured out exactly what chemicals to put together. Though most likely you know that already because this is a topic that gets talked about a lot. We've had a lot of like a socialized medicine topics, Medicare for all or whatever, whether it's in public forum or whatever else. It's just been a thing that's gotten talked about a lot. So there's going to be a billion back files for like, oh, this will disincentivize research and development, or oh, well, actually, like generics or blah blah blah. Well, most these patents are for Me Too drugs, or I don't know. I find it kind of boring, but I also have to keep in mind that I am not a 13-year-old doing LD for the first time. I'm somebody that's been around the debate world for a long time now and sees topics a lot, and just because I'm bored by something doesn't mean that you will be. So maybe that is a very interesting topic to you. The thing about this topic and the phrasing that I think is most interesting is the word reduce. Why does it say reduce and not eliminate property protections? Well, the reason is, I would suspect, I don't know for sure, if you are someone involved in the topic writing committee, or you can get me in touch with somebody in the topic writing committee, I'd be super interested in talking to people and getting their take on what's the process of writing these. Here's my guess. If the topic says eliminate intellectual property protections, reducing becomes net ground for a counterplan because it's competitive with eliminating it, and it probably solves for most of the affirmative. That's what, for example, with UBI, Universal Basic Income, there is nearly universal basic income. It's an existing model. Places have tested it. There's literature on it. You can read it as a counterplan because universal basic income trades off with nearly universal basic income. Same deal here. But what are the implications now that instead of eliminate it says reduce? Well, does that make eliminating it negative ground for a counterplan? In other words, does the negative get to come up and say, sure, your plan is to reduce it, counterplan, eliminate it entirely? I think some people will try that, and I think that'll win some rounds against people who don't know how to answer counterplans. But the weakness of that counterplan is that it's not competitive. Reducing something, even if it doesn't eliminate it, doesn't cost us the opportunity of also eliminating it, right? The best thing you could do is find some literature that says without complete elimination there's no solvency, and just go for a hard solvency argument, but I don't really see that working. what's a little bit more complicated here, and I haven't done much research into this, is I don't know what the World Trade Organization's intellectual property protections are. And in other words, I also don't know whether it's how it's quantified. It says reduce here. And if it was something like a subsidy, then I would be like, okay, we're currently giving like $1 million in subsidies for this thing, reduce it by 80% or by 50% or by 10%. But is that how intellectual property protections work? How are you going to, like, to me it seems like a binary thing. Like, you are allowed to make generic drugs or you're not. Like, what are you going to say? Like, you are allowed to make some amount of generic versions of currently protected medicine. It also doesn't say it lifts the intellectual property status, right? It just says that it reduces the protections. But I think more likely there's several protections and you would remove some protections. But I don't know what that looks like. All in all, of the three, I'd say this is probably the most workable one, the one that I most imagine working out, unless you're just sick of talking about this. In which case, let's go on to the next topic. Resolved. The European Union ought to sanction member states that violate Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. Okay, this is the beginning of a problem that I have with a lot of these topics, so I'll just talk about this now. As I mentioned earlier, there's, from my understanding, I coach college LD. Not as involved in high school LD historically. I'm involved. I've taught classes. I've coached it. I've judged it. But I'm just saying that, again, I don't know how these people came to these decisions, but here's my impression. The impression that I get is that there is a contingency from a more traditional background in LD that wants these topics to be like philosophically based. They want to argue ethics. They want to argue maybe different models of philosophy. I was a philosophy major. I'm very interested in philosophy. I know a good amount of philosophical concepts and have a strong background in it. So there's a contingency that wants that. And then there's a contingency that basically wants policy topics. As in someone does something, but also policy topics as in policy debate, right? Like, lets people emulate policy debate one-on-one, which is basically what college LD is. A lot of these topics seem to be written as, hey, here is a philosophical question about a policy decision. And that way you can take the philosophy angle or you can take the policy-oriented angle. There's a problem there. The problem there is ethical questions overlap with how a state should make decisions, but there are ways that a state or a policymaker ought to make a decision that is not necessarily the most ethical way of acting. They just have certain responsibilities that they have to act on in certain ways because of the role that they have. What that means is that the philosophical side of the debate always has to get channeled not through this concept of right and wrong, ought or oughtn't, but through what should a policymaker do, which really narrows the scope of effective, like, philosophical discussion. And then on the other hand, if you're trying to just have that policy-driven debate and you're the negative, you're going to want specifics, and affirmative is going to be able to get out of it by just being like, oh, we don't have to provide the specifics to you. All we have to show is that hypothetically, theoretically, ethically, it's a thing that should happen. And so it just it doesn't really let either aspect of LD really thrive. But it's probably a part of an effort to keep LD from splintering into two different events. Okay. Now let's talk about the actual topic. What is Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union? Well, Article 2 basically just says human rights exist. It's not so much about what Article 2 is. It's a question of what should we do when people are violating Article 2? In other words, when there's human rights abuses, the European Union should sanction them. Now, I already did this earlier because I looked into these, but I'll demonstrate here. Whenever you are researching a topic, this doesn't have 100% efficacy, right? But you want to approach it in parliamentary debate. We get, ideally, you know what your plan and your advantages are within 5 minutes of your 20-minute prep. Ideally in 3, but if you haven't figured it out at 5 minutes, you're in trouble. How do we do that? Well, people's instincts when they research something like this is to look up Article 2 of the Treaty Union, blah, blah, blah. And that's going to... Let's use the last topic as an example, actually, because I know this is actually going to go different. Okay, so one of the things that people will be tempted to research is intellectual property. And they'll be like, oh, let's just learn about intellectual property. But this is going to be a lot of reading that is really not going to apply. Let's just look at the Wikipedia article. This is a lot of reading before you get to anything that's going to be relevant. So you want to be more specific. So what are you going to do? You're going to be like, oh, intellectual property for medicines. Okay, let's search that up. And you're going to, you're going to find some stuff that's a little bit more specific. But again, this is a lot of reading before you really get a good sense of, well, what are the positives, what are the negatives. Here is the trick. If it's a good topic, you should put the entire resolution in the search bar and ideally find a specific proposal. And I haven't done this on this topic yet, but ideally you are finding a editorial that is written about that proposal that'll give you the background, how this kind of proposal would work, what the advantages are, what some concerns about it are, and then you can just turn that into the outline for your whole case. And from there, research other stuff and add cards. We'll see if this case has a specific proposal for that. In other words, has anyone in the world actually suggested that the World Trade Organization be the ones to do this? My hope is yes. Let's find out. Okay. Cool. Looks like it's something that they've done for COVID, or have considered. Here we go. They're considering waiving certain blah, blah, blah for COVID, for whatever. See, this is the case. This is the debate. And even if the COVID thing isn't relevant by September, that's why the topic doesn't say COVID. You would just basically apply this stuff to other medicines. So now going back to this, resolve the European Union should sanction members of blah, 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 what we would want is to look up the entire resolution, but we're not really finding a specific proposal. The closest thing we can find is You can see I looked some of these up. See, this just is explaining what this is, and I think if you look up sanction, it says that if they violate these things, they can be sanctioned. There is a sanction mechanism. That's about Article 7. And that's it, right? This doesn't really give us the same level of detail about a proposal to sanction people who violate Article 2. Actually, not people, states. We'll get to that in a second, too. This is the same thing. This is what I would read if I wanted to learn more about this topic. EU values are law, after all. Enforcing EU values through systemic infringement actions, that's actions in response to systemic infringements, by the European Commission and the member states of the European Union. This is the paper on which this topic is based, either intentionally or just like it's the paper that the article that this is based on comes from. And it'll go into whatever. This is what I would read. So there isn't exactly a specific proposal, but there has been a study on it, like literature on it. So that's not the worst. What are some problems with this? Well, what does the debate actually look like? Well, the affirmative is going to come up and they're going to say why human rights are really important. And the negative isn't going to really respond to that because what are they going to say? Human rights don't matter? The next thing that they're going to want to say is that sanctions are effective. And that's really where the debate is going to start. The negative is going to want to read certain arguments. One, they were going to want to read that sanctions are not effective. They would probably also want to read cards that say sanctions are violence. That, like, sanctions aren't soft power, sanctions are hard power. Sanctions kill people. Sanctions keep people from being able to eat. That just because it's not a gun firing a bullet doesn't mean it's not violence. You're taking an action that causes death somewhere else. Now, the question here is whether the status quo is good or bad. Now, as the negative, we don't want the status quo to be bad because that'll force us to run a counterplan. Here, status quo is probably bad, right? Now, maybe there's not human rights violations happening everywhere all the time, but it's the status quo of the scenario we're talking about. In other words, are human rights violations being addressed well by the status quo? Can we count on them getting resolved the way things are going? Probably not. So that puts the negative in the position of needing a counterplan. As it so happens, there's a good counterplan on this topic. The topic says the European Union ought to sanction member states that violate Article 2. But there are other kinds of sanctions. There's other people you could sanction. For example, and I don't remember the exact term for this, but we do it with Russia. Sanctioning individual people, Russia. There is a name for this kind of sanction. It's named after like a court case or no, it was named after like a guy that was killed in Russia. Can sanctions be blah 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 for I don't remember, but you can find this. There's the United States, and by extension any country that wants to adopt this practice has the ability to sanction individual people who are responsible for certain actions instead of just an entire nation's economy. And that works really well in a country like Russia that is kind of like an oligarchy where political decisions are made by a discrete group of people, not discrete like quiet, but discrete like individual. And those people are in power specifically because of their like economic strength. So it's really easy to target these people and be like, hey, these businesses, everything that's related to this person, the United States is not going to touch. That is going to have an effect on this person, is probably going to encourage some sort of whatever. But some random Russian person on the street, in theory, doesn't have food taken out of their mouth. Seems like a pretty good counterplan, especially because this topic is incredibly vague, which is something that the AF and the neg are going to struggle with, right? Like, the biggest question, which I'm sure is what that article I pointed to is going to talk a lot about, is how do you determine when someone has violated Article 2? How much of a violation does it take to get a sanction? What kind of sanction? How much of a sanction? When do they get sanctioned? Do they need to be repeat offenders? How much do they need to repeat? The more plan-focused your debate is, the harder it's going to be for the affirmative to be like, this is exactly how our affirmative works, because there isn't a specific proposal. If there was a specific proposal, then you could just say, we take John Schmitty's proposal. Here it is. It's 40 pages. You can read it if you want, but we're just doing that. Any questions you got about how it works, it's in there. Like, I don't know it. I haven't memorized the 40 pages, but let's look through the card and let's figure it out. But if you are making up your advocacy, then it falls on you to have answers to those questions. Like, how does it happen? When does it happen? How much are the sanctions? Like, what things get sanctioned? When do the sanctions get lifted? Are they conditional based on whether they stop the human rights abuses? How do we measure? So if I do a human rights abuse, like if I kill a group of people and then I no longer kill that group of people, is there no punishment for that? If there is, like, what needs to change in order for me to not be sanctioned anymore? Like, these are things that I would force an affirmative to answer, especially if I had some sort of like vagueness or spec argument prepared on the negative, which is why I don't like this topic as much. International human rights are a topic area that I'm passionate about, but the phrasing of this topic I don't think makes for as clean of clash. Okay. Resolve, the member states of the African Union ought to further advance the goals of continental integration. Everything I said about the last topic, double it. The first question here is, what are the goals of continental integration? And what I mean by that is this a specific concept? In other words, has the African Union come together and written a mission statement for this is what our goals for integration are? We want to reach these specific milestones, maybe even by these dates, or like these are the things that we consider specifically to be a integrated continent. I hope so, because if that doesn't exist, then this topic is really difficult. But even then, this topic isn't specific about what the plan text will be, right? Like, oh, and I found, so let's look up the topic, right? First of all, let's think about the negative. Is the status quo good? I mean, no. Right? Like, I don't know what, like, maybe the lack of integration and the economic independence or whatever, maybe you can say that stuff is good, but generally speaking, how's the status quo of Africa? Not great. There's a lot of poverty. A lot of countries are being put into debt traps. There's a lot of diseases that are killing lots of people, like Ebola and HIV and malaria, and there's underdevelopment, and there are terror groups like Boko Haram, and things just generally are not awesome. So will continental integration be the solution to that? I have no idea, but the affirmative gets to say, hey, maybe it will be. Let's give it a shot. And the negative doesn't get to say anything. They get to say, let's keep things the way they are. Why don't they get to run a counterplan? Because counterplans have to solve for the affirmative. In other words, unless your counterplan is a method of capturing the advantages that the affirmative wants to run, you can't really run a counterplan, because then it just becomes another advantage versus disadvantage debate, and it makes things very messy. And you'll need advantages and disadvantages anyway, and if they're not related directly, it makes it hard for it to be competitive, right? If your counterplan is like, hey, let's integrate in these, or let's not integrate in these ways, then the affirmative can just be like, right, but that doesn't have anything to do with the specific way that we do want to integrate. So let's integrate here, but not integrate in some other way. So when there's a huge list of potential affirmatives, what you want to do is you want to see, okay, is there a literature base, right? Is there a specific proposal for how to do this? And then you can, for example, read topicality that says, hey, the topic literature is specific to this, right? So I think for the sake of education, we should focus on the actual methods that people have talked about. And you can see here that I did click on one. African Union, which way forward? If I am the affirmative and I have a topicality read against my plan in this topic, I'm going to read a counterinterpretation that cites this article and says any of these are valid affirmative plans because it's very clearly in the topic literature. The African Union, which way forward? Let's see, does it say integration in the first? Integration, national integration, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Oh, that's it. Yeah, so take a look at this. Here's all of the proposals. Or some. I'm sure there's more. Okay. Which way forward? Pressing Sudanese leaders for peace. Ending the crisis in Burundi. The AU and the Libyan crisis. Long-term goals: supporting good governance, create institutions for improving the livelihood of the average citizen, strengthen the African Court of Justice and Human Rights, facilitate economic integration, transform from the AU from observer to actor, address poverty and inequality, respond effectively to pandemics, ensure the equitable allocation of and access to water. Lots of different things here. Now, maybe you can read arguments that say, hey, these aren't all integration. Only economic integration is integration. But it's vague enough that it's just gonna be a topicality debate, right? You don't want a topic where you have to win T, because you can get outskilled pretty easy in that. So, with this many potential AFs and an indefensible status quo, I think this is just a really rough topic for the negative. I don't recommend it, but maybe you like it. Maybe you want to talk to me about it. My girlfriend, who I live with, is moving to New York in a few days, and I'm not going to have anyone to talk to except you, potentially. I'll talk about the African Union. Just please leave a comment and talk about these topics. Let's go to November. Resolved, in the United States, the use of mandatory arbitration clauses as a condition of employment ought to be prohibited. I didn't know what that was. I looked into it. A mandatory arbitration clause says it's a contract that employers make you sign, and I don't know if they are just because you sign something doesn't mean it holds up in court, right? Like with terms of service or whatever, just because you clicked that you agree you read them doesn't actually mean that a website isn't liable for anything they do. So there's some question as to how well they're holding up in court, and I think that's probably why the topic is actually getting discussed. Probably, I think some sort of Supreme Court thing. But what is it? What does it mean? A mandatory arbitration clause is if you're starting a job. Let's say you want to work for me. No one does. Nobody gets paid to do any of this. But let's say you wanted to, and I was going to throw you some money to, I don't know, leave comments. And then I don't pay you, or I don't know, something that you want to sue me for some reason. A mandatory arbitration clause says that you have to handle that like conflict within the company. Like, for example, with HR or something, if like a manager does something that you don't like, you have to go through the business's channels to handle that, sort of like a military court. How you don't really do that in other court. Here's the thing. Like, why? Right? Like, I understand why a business might want to have this, but as a group of people who are not in that business, why would we want to defend their ability to do that? Like, what's the neg ground here? So, ought to be prohibited. There's only one piece of neg ground, right? You're not going to be able to be like, "Oh, what if Jeff Bezos can't go to Mars?" The only argument, and I'm not even sure that this is going to link, because I don't really... It's a very generic argument. What is a generic disad, in case you're not familiar, or you don't write a lot of cases, or you don't do parley? A generic disadvantage, super useful in something like parliamentary debate, but also outside of it, is a disadvantage that could get triggered by any number of government actions. And so what you do is you research the internal link, like, story, right? Like, if this scenario happens, what happens first, what happens next, where does it lead? And you write out the impact story and you put it in a file. And every so often you update... Why am I getting a phone call? I thought I turned off my... How did I get a phone call without self-service? All right, sorry about that. How's this? Okay. Right. Every now and then you update the uniqueness. So let's say it has to do... Well, I'll just give it the specific example. Court clog. Court clog is a generic argument. And what it says is, hey, right now there's a lot of court cases, but they're going okay. Things are kind of working. But we're on the brink of where we cannot handle the number of cases we need. What your plan does is it creates a lot more cases that have to go to court. Now, there's a finite number of judges. There's a finite number of courtrooms. There's a finite number of public defenders. There's a finite number of prosecutors, which means the more court cases there are, the longer it takes for each case to happen, thus the clog. There's the impact of court clog. I don't know whether the impact story would be specifically for civil suits, but I would imagine something along the lines of, if you're owed money, or you're owed something, it takes you longer to get it, which is not just a delay, it's a significant barrier, because that means more time that you have to pay legal fees, and that will make it very difficult for you to seek justice for things that happen to you, because it will make it so that you can't afford to sue people, or you can't afford to defend yourself in a lawsuit, so you have to settle in lawsuits that are what's the word I'm looking for, frivolous. But in the non-civil court, the one that they put you in jail for, court clog is a really big deal, because when you get arrested, you are innocent. You are innocent until you get sentenced. Until then, you are in jail, unless you can afford bail, which is very, classist. But say you can't afford bail, you're in jail. Everyone in jail is innocent by definition, unless, I don't know, sometimes they put prisoners in jail or whatever. But that's the difference between jail and prison, is jails are for innocent people that are awaiting trial. And they suck. They're not good. People will get stabbed and die. Conditions are horrible. The UN has called our prison system, including our jail system, cruel and unusual torture. And the more court clog there is, the longer people have to wait before they can not have to be in jail. So that's really the only net ground I can think of, and I'm not really even sure how much it links. But what else is the net ground? Help Google not get sued? I don't know. You gotta be I'm trying to avoid the term bootlicker. But you gotta be a real chump to go out of your way to be like, well, we need Amazon to not lose any profits or frivolous lawsuits, and no, come on. You're never gonna win that on the negative. The only grounds I see are the court clog. I'm not terribly convinced. So, don't love this topic. What's our next option? Resolved. A just government ought to recognize an unconditional right of workers to strike. This is the perfect example of the bad middle ground I was mentioning earlier between philosophy topics and policy topics. Because, well, there's other issues, right? But it's a concept of what ought to happen, but also channeled through the practicalities of a real country. Now, one thing that I think is weird about this topic is that it's kind of a negative concept. Not negative like it's a bummer. Negative as in it's talking about the lack of something. In other words, another way to phrase this topic would be a valid exception to the right of workers to strike doesn't exist. Because there's no debate here about whether workers should have the right to strike. It's just a question of, should there be conditions on that? Now, the reason why I think the topic is phrased weird, because if I was to tell you, hey, the topic of this debate is that all ravens are black, and someone got up and gave the first speech, well, the first thing you would expect is someone giving an example of a raven that is not black. Right? Oh, here's a picture of a raven that has albinism. But it wouldn't make sense for someone to go up and be like, great, so here's 8 ravens that are black. Right? Here's a raven, and look at the color of the feathers, and it's black. Here's another raven. color of the feathers, and it is black. And then someone comes up and says, here's this albino raven, or here's a species of raven that's purple or whatever, and then you have the debate. But imagine that happened, right? When that happens, the affirmative second speech has nothing to do with their first speech. It's just a response to the negative speech with this albino raven. Same thing happens here. What is the affirmative going to talk about here? That, like, workers should have the right to strike and why that's good? But what, like, maybe they can point to specific, the best I can figure out is they can point to specific exceptions that are made and say that they are bad. But without that, like, it's mostly on the negative to drive what we are going to talk about, because the negative doesn't have to defend the exception that the affirmative points out, right? Like, if say the affirmative is like, hey, some places don't let women strike, and that is a bad condition, the negative doesn't have to come up and defend that specific condition being placed on it, that specific exception. They come up with their own exception, and the affirmative has to respond to that. So with the way this debate is set up, it's the affirmative being responsive to the negative, but having only the short middle speech in which to do it, which is why I don't think this topic, for my taste, with my understanding, and in my opinion, wasn't written right, wasn't phrased right. Now, what is the negative gonna say? I'm sure there's some exception you can think of. Police strikes aren't great. It's a way for a group of people that have a lot of criticism earned to threaten a community with death and violence if they don't give them their way. So that could be like, hey, the police are not allowed to strike. That should be an exception. Or elected officials should not be allowed to strike. You can resign, or you can do your job. I don't know how much water that holds. So in that sense, like, okay, maybe it's not the easiest thing to be the negative on this topic, but it's still oddly phrased, and the framing of the debate is really weird, because I think the affirmative's first speech is going to have nothing to do with what the debate ends up being about. It's just going to be, well, what is the exception that the negative is going to propose, and then the affirmative has to counter that. So that's something that I think is weird. Third topic, resolve. The United States ought to condition trade agreements on adherence to enforceable labor standards. Okay. I don't really like econ and trade and those topics. That's just me. But let's talk about it. There's a lot of leeway here, right? Like, we're talking about, like, generally, philosophically, like, in some ways we should do this, even if it's not, like, a pragmatic thing to do? Or are we just saying if it were done, it would be better than if it were not done, regardless of whether it's possible to be done? Or are we saying the United States should do this, thus here's our plan text, this is the specific labor standard that we will hold this specific country to in this specific trade agreement? You can go hyper broad, hyper specific. I think it's fine. Like, if you're the negative, like, what are you going to say? Like, labor standards are bad? Like, we should have sweatshops and slave labor in other countries and uphold that? Probably not. It's not a lot of counterplan ground because, again, the affirmative is super slippery, right? If you try to criticize a vague thing, or like, there's a lot of potential laughs, right? I already kind of talked about why counterplans might not work in instances like this. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe you can talk about like econ, supply and demand, and that's gonna mess with the where they. I personally I don't like this topic. So for November, I mean, I don't know. Take your pick. I don't really like any of them. I would guess probably the best one is the second one. I think the way it's set up is weird. Other than that, it's a good topic, right? I think one side being like, here's the exception that we are defending for the right of workers to strike, is a good framing for a round. I just think it should be the affirmative that tries to come up with the exception, rather than the affirmative just stating that there is no exception and then waiting for the negative to introduce their advocacy. With that said, let's talk about January/February, which I assume those are two difficult words to combine, so I'm imagining most people probably say Jan-Feb. Okay. Resolved. States ought to ban gain-of-function research. Whew. Okay. This is actually where I stopped, I think. Yeah, this is where I stopped earlier. Because I went on a huge tangent on conspiracy theories, and then my class was starting, and I was like, screw it. I wasn't like that. I never say that term. I'm just trying to curse less in this video. Even though that's probably still not... Whatever. Okay, what is gain-of-function research? Gain-of-function refers to the thing that is gaining a function is a pathogen. A pathogen means something that causes a disease. Gain-of-function research is research on a disease, or more accurately, a pathogen. A disease is a condition of the body. The pathogen is what caused that disease. It's research on a pathogen which increases its deadliness, or how harmful it is, or just gives it new functions. This research exists. It's done all over the world in various laboratories, and it's highly controversial. Part of the tangent that I went on, that I'll cover a little bit of now, is that there are... I had a list of 7, and I used to teach this to kids, but I haven't really given this lecture in like a year and a half, 2 years, because COVID. And it started being really scary for kids. The concept of extinction is a relatively modern concept. Certainly more recent than the concept of evolution. Because think about it. Before we knew that animals exist because of a specific lineage that they come down from, we didn't understand that an entire species could cease to exist. When you think about like Journey to the Center of the Earth, like in the center of the Earth, Jules Verne wrote that there's dinosaurs there. Partly because it's just the concept that this animal exists and it just doesn't exist anymore is a very unintuitive concept to a civilization that doesn't understand evolution. And only after we started to understand evolution did we eventually start to understand that the dodo bird's never coming back. That's just gone. We recorded it going extinct, but didn't really understand what that meant. And not long after we realized that animals can go extinct, we realized that humans could go extinct. And the study of the apocalypse is called eschatology. So let's talk about it. What are the most likely extinction scenarios for humans? I'm pretty sure that there were 7, but something like 5 come to mind right now. Generally going from least likely to most likely. Least likely, a cosmic event. By cosmic event, I mean like a gamma ray burst or something. It's not unlikely. There's something called the Fermi paradox, which is the question of if there's so many stars, so many planets, so many places that could potentially harbor life, and life could have existed for millions, intelligent life could have existed for millions and millions and millions of years, and light travels at the speed of light, and radio signals or blah, blah, blah. Like, why can't we find any signal, any trace of any intelligent species anywhere in the universe? Partly is we haven't really looked that much. But if you were on another star and you were, let's see, from 1938, somewhere between 90 light years of us, you would know that you could easily find out that Earth has intelligent species on it, because you would get our TV signals or radio signals, stuff like that. Whatever. One of the potential solutions to that is that every so often there's like a gamma ray burst that wipes out all life around it, and that this happens enough that life can't really sustain itself for that long. But the frequency of something like that is so long that it's the least likely thing to take out humans. That's at the least likely side. More likely, a near Earth object. That's asteroids and comets, right? Took out the dinosaurs. That wasn't total extinction. Might be enough for human extinction. Maybe a bigger one hits us. For example, the moon was caused by a big impact with the Earth. So something of that level, like, yeah, that would take us out. But still not super, super likely. After that is like a super volcano, like Yellowstone or something going off. That almost took us out once. And 60,000 years ago, in what is now Indonesia, in the area that is now a giant lake called Lake Toba, there was an event called the Lake Toba catastrophe, where a volcanic explosion happened that was so big that it put the Earth into winter for like 3 years, and 90% of humans died. A little bit bigger would have taken out 100. Who knows if we'd survive it now? Blah blah blah. What are we at? Was that number 3? Yeah, I think maybe there's 6, because I'm pretty confident about the next ones. After that is environmental collapse. We make the oceans acid, and that creates a domino effect of species that eat other species dying, and ecosystem collapse means that blah blah blah, and we don't get a lot of food. That's kind of likely. Next is nuclear, like a nuclear apocalypse. That's pretty big deal, especially considering how many nukes we have, that more and more countries are trying to build nukes, and you have to consider these things are dangerous for thousands of years. Like their ability to cause nuclear winter doesn't go away for thousands of years, and we have so many of them already. And it just takes one bad day, and like one bad day anytime in the next 60,000 years, and that's kind of it for humans. More likely, most likely by far, and finally coming back to this is all for your impact files, but finally coming to the topic, the most likely human extinction event by far is a disease pandemic, to the point where it's like kind of how we're gonna go eventually, unless we figure out something amazing, and we kind of are. Like, our medicine's like keeping up okay, but the world is just really, really interconnected. The Black Plague was in Central Europe in 1345, let's say. Maybe later than that, but it wasn't until 1349 that it reached Norway. It took years, if not just months, but still, it took a long time for a disease to reach one part of Europe to another part of Europe. Fast forward, you get AIDS travels around the world relatively quickly, pretty quickly. But by the time we're talking like COVID, especially like an airborne disease in a world that you can't stop people from traveling from country to country. COVID had spread to basically every country in the world before we detected it. So that's a pretty significant issue. Now, as to what this topic is talking about, we don't know that the current coronavirus, that the COVID-19, I think, is the disease. I'm not, whatever. We don't know that it wasn't made in a lab. Could have been, might not have been, but it's certainly, like, things like that are made in laboratories, places. Now, they could be made for good reasons. It's important to study these diseases because they will ultimately, like, help us combat them when they naturally arise, or when things like them naturally arise. Now, COVID might have been made in a lab. Like, it could have been made in a lab, but it also could have occurred naturally. So that's the point, right? Like, the reason to make something like it in a laboratory is to study it, to be able to respond to it if something like that naturally arises. If naturally occurring coronavirus, a coronavirus is like flu, the cold. It's a type of virus. If something naturally occurring that has some of those traits comes up because of human contact with diseases, because with like animals, or climate change, waking up microbes, or whatever, like all of these natural factors are making it so that pandemics are going to happen more and more and more. Coronavirus, COVID-19, is not going to be the last major world shutting down pandemic that we are going to see in our lifetimes, unfortunately. With mRNA vaccines, like our ability to respond to the future ones might be a little bit faster, might be a little bit more effective, or we might have worse luck next time. I don't know, but it's going to happen more. Like, we have no mechanism in place to prevent the introduction of new diseases to humans, or even slow it down. So, It's a question of, are these that's the reason why you might want to have gain of function research. That's a net ground, right? Like, we need this to understand this. Blah blah blah. The downside of that is bioweapons. It's, what if it was made in a lab and it was specifically for this kind of thing? And like, you would say, oh, well, that's mutually assured destruction, but you don't need to have like plenty of, speaking of eschatology, many world views are eschatological. For example, like, the mutually assured destruction is not a deterrence to suicide bombing. Like, the suicide bomber knows that they're going to blow up, and yet they still carry out their action, right? Like, we put a lot of stake in the concept of like a rational actor to begin with, but even then, like, people can be rational actors and still not interested in their own well-being. When we don't dislike these people, we call them martyrs and celebrate them. So it's not out of the question that like banning it could be good, because, you know, or just prevent an accident from happening, right? Which is the reason to ban nuclear weapons, because long enough time scale, these things are very dangerous, accidents can happen, and then whoops, lab leak, and now you have like super COVID or super tuberculosis, right? Tuberculosis is the one to look into, by the way. Tuberculosis is the disease that is responsible for the most human deaths, and it's not a virus. So that means you can't have a vaccine, and we have a bunch of cures for it, but they're becoming increasingly ineffective. And eventually, like, there's a finite number of things that can treat it. Once it's resistant to all of those, we're just back in the dark ages with tuberculosis killing most people. Consumption, they called it. But anyway, so lab leaks can happen, all of that stuff. The only question here is, how effective can the AF be? You're banning what's the topic? States ought to ban gain of function research. Well, there's non-state actors, right? Like, non-state actors is a probably more in terms of international relations, like, accurate term for what many people will call like terrorist groups, right? Like, what's the difference between a terrorist group and a like freedom fighters, right? Non-state actors is the more neutral term. And non-state actors, if they can't do this research now, they should be able to in the future, right? So there are some efficacy questions, there's some solvency questions, there's some questions of how dangerous is it for us to play with this stuff, and there's a question of how dangerous is it for us not to play with this stuff. I think it's a cool topic. I think there's not a lot of diversity in the arguments. I basically just hashed out the entire topic for you. It's not like people are going to be able to come up and be like, ooh, here's my plan text that totally takes people off guard. It's going to be a much more focused debate, but it's interesting. I don't have a clear AF or neg vote on this one. Let's move on to the next one. Resolved. The United States ought to ban the use of germline genetic engineering in humans. I know what genetic engineering is. What is germline genetic engineering? Well, let's do the whole topic. Okay. Well, it's already banned. So, mission accomplished, team. You don't have inherency. What? Oh, experts are calling for a ban. Oh, but spending earlier. Oh, dropped ban. Oh. Yeah, okay. Gene editing. Interesting. I don't like, why put all the interesting ones in one month and then have the previous month be rough. Okay, gene editing. Watch the movie Gattaca. That's the topic. The background is that it's incredibly classist. Like, it could be dangerous, but that's not really the concern. The concern is that it's incredibly classist, and it basically makes it so that you make non-genetically engineered... It's Gattaca, the second-class citizen. The neg ground is obviously a counterplan, a pick, that's like, except in the instances where it's battling... So this is actually a little bit of a tricky thing. There are groups of people who are living with conditions that are not, say, the norm, right? Non-neurotypical people often, or people living with disabilities. And a lot of these people in these groups are of the opinion that they are a, like, valid group of people, that, like, of course they're valid groups of people, right? But that their condition is not something that is wrong with them. So what is a disease? How do we define an illness? Whether physical or mental. So for example, aging, not an illness. It'll kill you, but it's not an illness. Why? Or let's say being super smart, like, is abnormal, but not an illness. In order for something to be considered an illness, it has to be, like, atypical, like, not normal, and harmful. So if you look at, like, the IQ is a really problematic, like, scientific measure. Like, it doesn't really describe anything useful. But whatever. Let's use the IQ bell curve. It's there's no, like, there's nothing biologically different in the mechanism, in the process of. It's not like, oh, if you are, like, way on one end, it's a disease, but if you're way on another end, it's not a disease, and that has something to do with something in your body. The only difference is they're both away from normal, but we consider one to be harmful and one not to be harmful. But the concept of harm is poorly defined and is relative. And there's question as to, for example, many people with autism are like, okay, like, I don't have the same perspectives as a neurotypical person, and maybe I don't have the same, like, social cues or whatever, but I don't care about that. Like, why is that harm to me that I don't meet your standard for what you like? My life is not harmed, and I'm not interested in, like, I don't see it as a thing to be cured. And that's perfectly valid. There's a lot of people trying to end the, like, disease classification of something like autism. But there's a whole spectrum of, well, no pun intended, of things, right? It's just not clear what we consider to be harmful, what we consider to be a disease, and that's a whole can of worms when you're talking about gene editing. Because on paper, you're like, hey, we can prevent a lot of stillbirths. That seems pretty good. We can prevent, or, like, miscarriages and stuff like that. Great. But then when it comes to like, we can prevent people from being born with certain disabilities. Well, certain disabilities you might not get a lot of kickback, and other ones you will. And is it erasure of people? Maybe. I think it's a pretty interesting topic. I think it's an important topic. Not because of the nuances of banning something and not banning it, and is the process dangerous or is the process not dangerous. What's interesting to me is the question of, assuming we could do this thing, what should it be done, and in what instances should it be done? Now, as a competitive debate topic, it's what we said earlier with the reduce. This one doesn't say reduce, and so the negative gets to defend a counterplan, a pick that says, hey, instead of reducing it, why don't you just reduce it, or like eliminating it, why don't you just eliminate it in all instances but this? And if you can show one instance that it should not be banned in, then the only grounds that the affirmative has to go for is reading theory that says your plan-inclusive counterplan is unfair. Now, usually the best picks bad theories are saying no picks on a whole law res. This is not a whole law res. But that'll be the debate, and it'll get kind of technical, and then it'll be more of a theory debate than an actual discussion of the stuff that you would learn about ethics. Next topic. Resolved. The appropriation of outer space by private entities is unjust. Next. I don't know, like, what do you mean? First of all, how are you appropriating outer space? Like, I get it. I don't want space to become corporate, but appropriating implies that it belongs to somebody else, or that it's publicly owned. And it's just not. Like, Mars is Mars. It has nothing to do with us. The appropriation of outer space by private entities. Like, why is outer space commodities different than any other commodity, other than it has not yet been appropriated, which also doesn't matter because we're not talking about a policy. We're talking about, like, the ethics of it, the justice of it. In other words, is there a scenario where appropriating outer space by private entities is unjust, but appropriating natural water resources in California by private entities is just? Probably not. If you're arguing that it's unjust to commodify and appropriate outer space, you would probably be against similar instances happening on Earth. Which means the outer space part doesn't really play any... I mean, I get it. It's exciting. Space. I like space. Before I was a philosophy major, I was an astronomy major. And then I took my first astronomy class, and I was like, math? Nobody told me there would be math. I wanted to watch, like, Carl Sagan stuff. I don't know. I think the space here is just not really going to matter. The literature that I would cut, that I would read, is going to talk about appropriation of resources on Earth, and then just apply that to space, because there's probably not a lot of research, like literature on space resources right now that aren't completely based in conjecture. So that's my short take on a topic that I don't really like. Okay, Mapril. I don't know if that's Marpril. I'm gonna go with Mapril. Sounds like April, May, but that would be reverse chronological. Marl. Okay, fine. March, April. Resolved. In the United States, single-family zoning ought to be abolished. Ooh, what does that mean? What is single family zoning? I actually don't have to look this one up. Again, like there's a pretty short list of good topics to talk about. So after a year of doing Parley, you've talked about most of them at some point. Single family zoning means that only one household, one family can live in a house. So what that means is you aren't allowed to say, I live in a house right now, I rent. I don't know if I'm in a single family zone, but let's say I was. I couldn't tell two different families like, hey man, this is a 2-bedroom, but why don't we just split it up? Like one family lives in the garage, I'll live in the studio, another family can live in the bedroom, and it'll be shared space, everything else, one bathroom, kind of a hell. But listen, it cuts down on a lot of homelessness. A lot of families in a lot of places in the world make do with stuff like that. And nobody's going to be forced to do it if they don't want to. So what's the neg, right? Like homelessness is a very big problem. So you're not going to defend the status quo. The cost of housing is a very big problem. So you can't really defend the status quo there. What's the downside? That like the reason it doesn't exist is NIMBYism. What is NIMBYism? NIMBY, short for not in my backyard, which is there's a lot of solutions to homelessness that would address the problem, but people don't want those solutions to be implemented in the town that they live in. They want schools to be better for inner city kids, but they don't want the inner city kids going to their kids' school in the suburb. And they want homelessness to be they don't want people like doing drugs out in the middle of the street, but they don't want the people that are doing drugs in the middle of the street to be their neighbor. And that's the problem, right? But in a debate, you don't, like, that doesn't have a role in the discussion. It's a question of, if this happened, would the results objectively be more good or more bad? Like, we don't pick the people whose experience we're prioritizing. That's not universally true, but we're certainly not going to pick like, oh, well, what will the neighbors in Beverly Hills think? Like, nobody cares. So what's the net ground here? Exactly. Maybe I'm missing some nuance in the topic. Resolved. The United States ought to restrict the power of the Supreme Court to overturn federal law. What? That's the purpose of the Supreme Court. Why? It seems like, oh, we want a Supreme Court topic, but we don't want to say expand the court, and we don't want to say give term limits, and we don't want to say kick certain people off of the Supreme Court, or change, have them be elected instead of appointed. So what's left? I guess let's run this. Is anyone actually proposing this? Not that I'm seeing. Oh, here we go. Vox. The only Fox is the ghoulish precog. And two law professors, Ryan Doffler and University of Chicago, Sam Memorial, recently released a paper laying out a way to democratize the Supreme Court by weakening its ability to strike down federal laws. Okay, well, first of all, that's not... Well, it is a restriction. Okay, so this is your topic. It's this paper. If you think this paper is interesting, pick this topic. Cookie settings. Don't. You win. Confirm my choices. Great. Yeah, this is the topic for the thing, and this looks like just the abstract, but maybe it also has the whole 71-page paper. Listen, I know I would go through this and cut it. Maybe you don't want to, but desirability. Here it is. Here's the whole topic. Here's my guess. You don't want to do this topic. Now, maybe that is, maybe I'll read that and I'll be like, totally changed my mind. But the Supreme Court strikes down federal laws in accordance to other federal laws, or at least in accordance to the Constitution, which it does not have the power to change. In other words, the Supreme Court cannot create precedents or literature on which to base its own decisions. Meaning, if there's a federal law and the court strikes it down because it violates another law, then all the federal government has to do is change that law. Now, there is a lot of politics in there, because usually, like, the problem is that that there is a political power right now that is trying to do something, but they don't have whatever, like, they need the courts to do it, and then the court strikes it down, and it's undemocratic because the people currently in charge are blah 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 blah. But you can't pass a law through Congress because there's a lot of whatever, and they stop the, I don't know. It's just not super interesting to me. And I don't know. It's fine. I haven't read that paper. I don't know what the justification is, and I don't know what mainly I don't know what kind of restriction it is. Personal reforms? Well, it can't be personal reforms because it has to be. Well, it doesn't say that it has to be from outside of the Supreme Court, but whatever. There's two reforms. Basically, there's two apps. I don't know. It's definitely better than single-family zoning. Let's see what the third topic is. In a democracy, okay, let's see. In a democracy, a free press ought to prioritize objectivity over advocacy. Actually, it's not the worst topic in the world. I mean, it's a value debate, but I like value debate. If you don't, then it doesn't matter what I am going to say about it because you're not going to vote for it. Free press ought to prioritize objectivity over advocacy. I mean, no. Done. Why are objectivity and advocacy in conflict? Like, your advocacy should, like, that's the point of debate, right? That, like, you can have competing advocacies, but they're both based in objective evidence. So, when do those things come into conflict? Like, and also, like, what? Advocacy is in the editorial section of a newspaper, in the opinion section of a newspaper. It doesn't claim to be a statement of fact. What's the problem? What? A free press ought to prioritize, like, the word prioritize indicates somehow that objectivity and advocacy are coming into conflict. Like, because people want to advocate for something, they can no longer be objective. I don't see how that's true. Like, how is objectivity defined? Whoops. Sick. Yeah, okay, great. What? Your advocacy should be based on objectivity. Especially if you are the press. So, I don't know, whack topic. Moving on. 2022 National Tournament. Let's see. Resolved, a people's right to self-determination ought to take precedence over a state's right to territorial integrity. Yes. Yeah. What? No. Yes. Done. Next. Resolved. Radicalism is preferable to incrementalism to achieve social justice. That's a good topic. If you're gonna do a value topic, that's a good topic. Radicalism in Iran. I talk a lot about how one of the lectures that I give that I actually haven't put on this channel is, but I talk about it constantly, is just the desirability of the status quo. And if the status quo is bad, people are going to want to change it. And it doesn't matter if that risks making the status quo worse. They're just going to want to change it. So just, if you're the F, show the status quo is bad. If you're the neg, show the status quo is good. Because similarly, when the status quo is good, people don't want change. I'm from Iran. Iran had a lot of problems in the 70s. And people were very upset, and justifiably so, with the government that they had. And so there was a revolution. And the revolution made everything worse. And things are, I can pretty comfortably say, objectively worse than they were before. Probably the result of radicalism, because it encourages extreme views and quick action, and it's pretty anti-democratic, right? Like, it's the will of people, but it's anti-democratic process, because democratic processes are inherently incremental. So I can see that being an interesting debate, because obviously incrementalism also sucks, because incrementalism is the carrot on the stick that keeps people hoping something will someday be better, and it probably never will be. The thing that I struggle with either of these topics is my struggle with politics in general, which is that I'm just too pessimistic. Like, all of politics is two sides being so confident that all problems can be solved, and just being like, it's one of these two solutions, and so let's just figure out which of these two things to do. But I don't think that. I think they're inherent human problems. I don't think we can solve them, and I think everything will be bad forever. Yeah, but if you don't feel that way, then sure, I think this is a pretty decent topic. Way better than the last one. Resolved. A nation's obligation to mitigate climate change ought to be proportional to its historical emissions. No. It should be proportional to its ability to do that, right? Like, I don't know. I think it's a very childish thing to be like, but that's not fair. Like, who cares? We're all gonna die. Do you not want to die? Like, I kind of get it. We're all gonna die, and I kind of accept that. But you don't seem to like that. So, if you don't all want to die, do the thing that stops us all from dying. What, like, cui bono? Who benefits, right? Who benefits from a world where we tackle climate change less effectively? Well, nations, I guess the only way you could go about that is saying countries with more historical emissions ought to be more responsible. But even that should be irrelevant. It's, look, what can you contribute? You have an obligation to contribute that. I don't really see the other side being able to say much. Like it's unfair. Like, I don't care. Yeah, the best topic is radicalism is preferable to incrementalism. And it'll be a value nationals, and nationals is more traditional anyway, as far as I'm aware. I don't know if TOC happens in March, April. I think it does, so it would probably be something like the well, I kind of like the, well, no, it would be the Supreme Court one, I guess, was the one that I was thinking, or the single family zoning, maybe, whatever. So I guess everybody gets what they're happy with if March, April is more policy and the national tournament is more value, because my understanding is that is how the judging styles for those tournaments tend to be anyway. That's a little perspective. Which topics did you like? Which topics did you not like? Which takes did you think were bad? Which were good? That's all I have. This is the end of the video now. Let me know other stuff that you would like to see. If it's related to LD, awesome. If it's not related to LD, also awesome. Summer is just a little, I don't know, like, it's just slower. And so that's cool because I have a lot more time to make videos, but it's also lame because there's less feedback, there's less people watching, but what are you gonna do, huh? Okay, well, thanks. Bye.